Okay, I think we're good. Let's get started. Okay, so welcome everyone, and welcome to SharePoint Evolutions. So I guess many of you were probably in Ted's talk this morning, so put your hand up if you're in Ted's talk. Okay, so I'd say that's the majority, maybe 75%, something like that. Okay, so we're continuing this idea of SharePoint apps, and obviously it's a really big, crucial area for SharePoint 2013. And I guess in this talk, I follow on from Ted and perhaps dive a little bit deeper, and we'll look at some key scenarios. So I'm an independent consultant. I'm also head of development at Content and Code. Basically, they're a UK company that I've had a long relationship with. We've got around 20 or 25 devs there. My main role at the moment is making sure that we're all ready for SharePoint 2013 and so on. I have a blog at SharePointNutsandBolts.com, and you can find me on Twitter at ChrisO_Brian. So I replace the apostrophe in my name with an underscore. So I probably won't dwell too long on why Microsoft are moving to the apps model. You know, I'm hoping that you've probably already got some of that context and you understand that background. Clearly, Microsoft really want us to move some of our code that we're used to writing with the server-side API. They'd like to see that move off the SharePoint server, because then it can't cause performance or instability problems with the SharePoint environment. And really, it's about shifting the problem somewhere else. Now, perhaps the one thing I do want to say here is kind of a story about something that's our experience and our sort of thinking around this move to the apps framework. So back in the 2010 timeframe, myself, a colleague, Wes Hackett, and some other colleagues at Content and Code, for one client, we spent a lot of time extending the social capabilities of 2010. We effectively built SharePoint 2013 Social on 2010. Now, that client knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that this was probably coming down the line, but they didn't want to wait in providing these kind of tools to the business. So we built it, and it was a lot of code, a lot of development, a lot of agile sprints, and so on. And we actually owned the IP to that code. So we kind of completed that project, went back to the office, and the management at our company were saying, so we're not really a products company, but could we make this run in Office 365? Because maybe there's a product in here, you know, can we spend some time looking at that? So Wes, you know, took that problem and spent some time on it, and we did a lot of analysis of the code that we'd written over the last year and the big solution that we'd built, and we looked to see if we could make it run in Office 365. And the answer was we couldn't. No matter how hard we tried, we really couldn't do that. The whole model that we used hinged around timer jobs, and there's no way to deploy a timer job to Office 365. Now, it's interesting with the app model, we could make that run in Office 365 now, because we've got this ability to have code that runs somewhere else that is maybe performing like a timer job. It's some kind of scheduled process, and that calls into SharePoint using OAuth, maybe every hour or every night, and so on. So really, this does change the game somewhat for Office 365. Now, I don't know what your clients are like, but when we speak to our clients, a lot of these guys are telling us that they're probably not going to move to Office 365 yet, but maybe they're on some kind of roadmap to it. And maybe in 3 years, 5 years, a lot of our clients are saying that they do want to be there. So this whole idea of apps and understanding the app model as developers, you know, we think it's quite important. Now, you might also be familiar with this statement on MSDN. So this is where Microsoft say, if you're going to customize SharePoint, we'd like you to do it as an app. And Ted touched on something this morning where, you know, maybe you have to think about Microsoft's motivations and whether they really do align with your needs. I think the big consideration is how well you're running your SharePoint environment or how well your clients are running it. I've spent some time on the infrastructure side of SharePoint, and it really does open your eyes, if you're used to doing development, that actually running SharePoint in the enterprise is really hard. So doing backup and restore really well, doing DR, making sure that you're dealing with performance and scale. Actually, those things are quite hard, and SharePoint isn't the easiest platform to run. So Office 365 does get quite appealing. And of course, we've got the different hosting options. Again, I'm not going to dwell too much on this. The type that we're focusing on here is obviously the SharePoint-hosted apps. You obviously know, hopefully, that this is really JavaScript only. We've got no option for server-side code, so we're really limited in development terms to JavaScript. With the other type of apps, So cloud app is the umbrella term, and underneath that we've got provider-hosted apps, which is where you supply the servers. And then we've got auto-hosted, which is only Office 365, remember, but that's where we've got some components going to Office 365 and some components going to an Azure tenancy that Microsoft manage, and they automatically do the hookup for you, and it's really easy. And what comes with that is the ability to do things like SQL Azure databases. So if we need SQL data, then that's quite easy to do. You could imagine, of course, that we get some combination of this. So maybe I want to leverage some things in SharePoint, like maybe lists and libraries or content types, and that bit goes to SharePoint. That bit goes to the app web, if you're starting to understand what that is. But maybe we've got some remote components that are maybe working on a scheduled basis, like a timer job would. And that bit can't run in SharePoint. It's not JavaScript either, so that's off box. And we end up with some situation which is like a hybrid app. Now, I think every SharePoint 2013 deployment, or every client that's going to implement 2013, probably has three decisions to make on apps. First of all, are we going to allow them? There isn't a simple on switch. We have to do some configuration. We might have to create some infrastructure if we're going to do some form of provider-hosted apps. We also need to procure a wildcard SSL certificate. Those things don't come too cheap, and we might not have one around for the domain that we're planning to use. So you can see that there's a bit of planning and consideration required. We then need to think about whether we're going to allow apps from the store. So do we want any site owner with a credit card, or remember that some apps are free, any site owner that has the capability to be able to go and get any app from the store? Are we happy with that for our environment? Or do we want to have more governance around it? Perhaps we want to do some kind of validation of the apps in the store. And what we want to do is say, hey, you can't go and grab anything from the store. We're going to do some due diligence, some testing, and the ones that we like and we approve, we'll put in our internal app catalog, and you guys can just get them from there. And finally, if we're making customizations to our environment, do we heed that advice that Microsoft are giving us about whether all our customizations should be developed as apps? Or maybe we're perhaps in a different place where we think, do you know what? We're doing a good job of running SharePoint. All our operations stuff, so backup, restore, DR, we're on top of that. We're okay. So we could live with the farm solution model. We don't think that putting code on the SharePoint servers is such a bad idea. So it really depends on where you are with that debate. Now, let's think about these kind of hosting types. Right? So this conversation that I'm thinking about here, it hasn't happened between us and our clients yet, but I do think that some companies are going to go around something of a loop when they come to decide, okay, we're good with apps, but now what kind of app should it be? Does it need to be a cloud app, or can it be a SharePoint-hosted app? This is how I think this conversation might play out in some places. So first of all, we do some analysis of the different types, and we start to think, well, I'm not sure I like this idea of only being able to develop in JavaScript. I think that could be a bit limited, so we'll start to perhaps look at the other types. And then at that point, we're quite enthusiastic, okay? And we're starting to think, yeah, these provider-hosted apps, that's definitely the way to go. Because then I've got full .NET, and I've got WCF, and if I need a database, I can do it. Basically, there's no limits as long as I'm working in that client API. And then maybe an IT pro comes in the conversation, and he says, yeah, but hold on. Do you remember all that work that we did in sort of planning SharePoint for the enterprise, making sure that we had a good story on backup and restore and DR and lots of other service aspects? That took quite a while for us to get our servers live with SharePoint. Remember all those teams that we had to interface with to make sure that they were okay with their bits? We had to talk to networks, storage, SQL, ops, Windows teams. And we all had to sort of make sure that they were good to do their bits of support, and that took a long time for our production environment. If we were to stand up some new servers to do provider-hosted apps, we'd have to go through some similar process. So maybe it's not that straightforward. And then somebody has the bright idea of, okay, well, I'll tell you what, let's do provider-hosted, but let's put it in Azure, and then Microsoft are doing our backups for us. And if we need to scale up, then we can drag some sliders along, and that's all we need to do. And maybe all we need is one web role, one worker role, and maybe we're covered in Azure, right? So we start to look at that, and we think that maybe that's the answer. And then, we've been playing with these sliders in the Azure calculator, and actually that number seems to get quite expensive when we kind of bump these aspects of processor power, memory, bandwidth, storage. When we drag those up, that monthly cost goes up quite significantly. And then somebody starts to say, okay, so if that's the monthly amount I'm going to pay on Azure for some provider-hosted bits, is that more or less than I would pay if we stand these servers up internally? So somebody goes away and gives that some thought, and actually that's a difficult number to come by, right? We have to work out how much manpower goes into running some servers in our data center, how many people interface with it to do backups, to do restores, perhaps to patch the servers and do updates and things like that. So the CIO, he wants to know, look, is it cheaper for me on Azure or is it more expensive? Just tell me that and then we'll decide. But finding out is really difficult, and we can't sort of sum up how much effort people go into maintaining 2 boxes in our data center. Additionally, we're finding that people are used to projects and capital expenditure and signing off bits of budget like that. But when you're saying to them, so this is a monthly cost, it's got no end date, we don't know how long this system is going to be alive for, but if you stop paying the bill, then the whole thing's going to stop. Then actually, people start debating over which cost center could pick this up. And they're used to sort of the initial form of spending, but this new form where it's a monthly subscription, nobody's really ready for that in the enterprise, and we haven't done it yet, so we've got no precedent. So, we've got some operational or business concerns here. And then, by day 6, somebody's saying, tell me again, what was wrong with SharePoint-hosted apps? Can't we just go back there? And, now we've got some business requirements, perhaps, let's just take one more look and see if this is going to work. So, I guess the point really is that SharePoint-hosted apps, the barrier to entry is much, much lower than the other types. And if you've got some business requirements and you know that you can build it in a SharePoint-hosted app, I think that you will. And I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to focus on this hosting type today. Now, just as a general thing, this probably applies to all kinds of apps. We've got really some different ways of site owners obtaining apps in the enterprise. So we've got kind of a user-driven route. And it's kind of user-driven because these are supported by administrators. We've got the public store, of course, if we enable it. And our users, our site owners, they can go out there and they can get apps from there and install them to their SharePoint site. We've also got the app catalog. So this is where perhaps we've got apps that administrators have approved, or maybe it's apps that we've developed internally, but we can get apps from there as well. The other option is that an administrator can take steps to proactively push the app out, and then it's going to be installed to various team sites or my sites, whatever they might be, and there's no action required by the site owner. So the 2 paths there are that the administrator can use some PowerShell commands and install the app that way. When we do that, we have like an instance of the app attached to each team site, and that's kind of important because it really depends on your app's design as to whether that's the right path. The other alternative, something that Ted mentioned, is a tenant install. And in this case, we only have one instance of the app shared by the entire enterprise. Now, that's going to work if your app provisions some lists, and what you need is every team site to share those lists. If your app is designed in a different way, and really every team site should have its own storage and its own lists, then a tenant install is no good. I kind of talked through some of those aspects and how to do some of those things in a blog article I've got at the moment. Now, I'm going to show you an app that I built, and I think that you can't really see that, so you know that and I know that. But what I'm really trying to say here is that in the app model, we have this divergence of where things get provisioned to. So we have this thing called the app web. And if I create a list or a content type, and I do that the normal way in Visual Studio, then it doesn't land in the team site. It lands over here in the app web. And so what I'm trying to express here, I've got some lists and some pages and some features and content types, and they don't go into the main team site. They go into my app web. In my case, I do have some components that live in the team site. So I actually have a list that I read from, and I have an app part. and basically just because these are things I wanted to explore as I'm learning the app framework. Now, as I'm on this journey, I'm trying to work out how I should pick up apps and what knowledge I need to gain. There was a few things that I wanted to cover, even if it didn't really make sense in my app. But I knew these were key scenarios in app development generally. So I wanted to create some content types and provision lists and provision files. I knew that they would go in the app web, but I think that some apps can, they will want to leverage some of these SharePoint building blocks. I wanted to fetch some data from the host web, and I knew that this means I need a permission request, and the person installing my app needs to OK that permission request. I wanted to use the different techniques, so we've got different APIs on the client side. You might have seen Todd's talk, where he covers JSON and REST, and I wanted to do both of those to make sure that my development skills are going in the right direction. I wanted to look at app parts. App parts are quite useful. They're basically a window onto your app that actually lives in the host site. So it's an iframe, that's all it is, but there's a certain model that comes with it of using properties and certain capabilities. And it basically brings part of your app into the team site without the user having to go into the app each time. So it's something that we'll look at. And finally, I wanted my app to sort of consume farm or tenant scope services. So they could be things like search or user profiles. And they come with certain programming models, certain permission requests that accompany them. So we'll look at those too. Okay, so let's switch to the virtual machine. Okay, so I think the first thing I want to show is, let's say that I have created an app in Visual Studio, and you saw Ted do this earlier. For me to get the app package that's produced, I can't just compile. What I need to do is publish in Visual Studio. And I've blown things up for the projector, but the button is just off screen. If I hit that, then what I ultimately see is a .app file. So that is my app, and if I need to put it in the internal app catalog, or if I need to hand that off to somebody, then that's really the package. It's really just a zip file, and if I rename this, then I can see lots of my app artifacts in here, including a WSP. So basically, any lists and content types and declarative XML that goes in there. But basically, we've got these surrounding metadata files as well. Now, just so we're all clear, if I want to put that in an app catalog, then you can think of an app catalog as it's almost like some kind of list of apps, and knowing your awareness of the SharePoint building blocks, you could almost imagine what it might be. And the answer is it's just a list, right? It sounds like a grand thing, it's the app catalog, but it's just a list, or more specifically, a document library, because we've got some files attached. So if I go to Office 365, and I just kind of want to show that the app that I'm working with, it's a SharePoint-hosted app, and I can take that between Office 365 and on-premises SharePoint, and that's all going to work out okay. So I'm just going to go to my app catalog on Office 365. And within here, we've got an apps for SharePoint list, and that's my app catalog. And what you can probably guess is that I could just drop that into there, and it's going to say, yeah, it's already there. And that's basically the act of me putting an app in the app catalog. Now, once it's there, I can just go to any kind of SharePoint site, and I can add an app. Now, what we'll do is we'll go to the site contents page, add an app. Working on it, yep. Or let's just switch to my on-premises VM at this point. And here you can see in the apps that you can add, there's a couple of apps that basically I've created. Now, what we get here is this details page. And if I go to my other app, basically, when I drop the file into the app catalog, I can also supply some screenshots, some descriptions, and this basically helps my site owners understand what this app is about, whether it's useful to them. They can perhaps page through some screenshots of the app. They can see some description. This one doesn't have a big description. And then they can add it. Now this is the dialog they're presented with. This is the permission request. So my app needs certain permissions to work. And it's permissions that the site owner may or may not be comfortable with. So these get listed here. So this particular app, it needs to read items in the host site. It's going to execute search queries and so on. And then in Visual Studio, we'll just hit that. So my app is being installed. And just while we're thinking about that and those permissions, just to show you that these are really dealt with here. Okay, so this is the developer view now of creating this app. He has to tell the people installing it exactly what permissions are required. SharePoint doesn't do anything super complex of trying to analyze your code and then work out exactly what's needed. You have to specify this, and you specify it in this app manifest, which has this nice designer, or you could run directly in the XML. So if I go to edit the permission requests, you can see that down here I've got permission requests for lots of aspects of SharePoint. I could ask for permissions to a specific list, or ask for permissions to write to the news feed, or even the tenant. So for example, if I select tenant, and then specify the permission level as full control, then that's an app that can do quite a lot to your Office 365 tenancy or on-premises site collections, right? So you would perhaps need to think long and hard, even if that was an app that was reasonably trusted. And I'll come back to sort of this idea of trust and what an app can do later. So by now, my app should have installed, and there it is. So what we'll do is we'll just go and take a quick look at that. So this app is basically around the concept of tracking time. So I'm a consultant. I've been a consultant for many years. And Friday at 5 p.m. is the time when the lies, subterfuge, and misdirection go into my timesheet. And I'm sort of used to this scenario, so it's the idea that I use for playing around with apps. And it's a simple app. You know, it's not going to go into the store. It's not hugely useful, but it has been good in helping me understand the app framework. So we've got some bits on the page, and I've kind of styled them in such a way that it's really obvious what's coming from what. You might have seen from Ted's talk that by default you get no left navigation. So I've kind of put something in there and made it a certain color. What I want to do first of all is log some time. Now this takes me to a list that I've provisioned. This particular page is basically the one that comes with the list, so it's not on my master page. I could make it on my master page. But basically, just to show that I've got some of these building blocks. So if I create a list item in here, select the employee. So this is SharePoint's fancy type ahead people picker, which is really cool. I've got a lookup list in my app. It's good to know that sort of fundamental building blocks like that can be used. So elsewhere in this app, I have another list that stores some projects, and this is basically just a lookup field that's referencing that. If I select 8 hours and give that a date, then as you might be able to guess, if I go back to my home page, then I'm still below my target of 40, but my code is reading from that list. Now, just to show you where that 40 is coming from, if I go back to the host site, so I'm no longer in my app, this is the actual regular team site, I have a list here called utilization targets, and there's just one entry, which is for me. But you can see that my app is reaching back into the site in which it's installed to fetch that data, because that's another scenario I wanted to look at. Let me just go back in there. Okay, now let's just take a look at what we've got in the code side to support some of that. So here is my project. I've got some things in here like content types. and I'm defining some fields and so on. And this is the kind of XML that we're used to as SharePoint developers. I've probably got another one for project. Yeah, lots of declarative XML, the kind of stuff that we're used to. We've got some lists being provisioned. You know, they all have a schema XML and things like that, and nothing changes there. But the key thing to remember, of course, is that if I'm using these techniques, then all my lists and so on, they're being provisioned in the app web, not in the team site where the app is installed. Now, in terms of the page, we have this default ASPX page. I've kind of extended the code that Microsoft give you. They do a pretty good job of producing some default code that helps you understand how the page works with the JavaScript in the app and so on. But I've obviously needed to extend that. So what we've ultimately got is some divs on the page, and we've got a div for the logged hours total. It's just got this default content that you might have seen flash up. I have JavaScript that drops the right value into there, and the same for the target hours. And down the right, I've got some column to show related content, which we'll come on to in a sec. So this is all asynchronous, of course. It's HTML and JavaScript, because that's the SharePoint-hosted app model. And what we've got is all my JavaScript that runs this app. So I'm using strict mode in JavaScript. I'm trying to be a good JavaScript developer, and all my code is in a namespace. And you know, I'm trying to get on board this wagon of producing good JavaScript. Yeah, challenging, but fun as well. So first of all, I need to look up the current user. Okay, so I've got this method which is load user and run other code. So I find out the current user, and if I come into my success handler, then I go into other methods like fetch the logged hours from the app web and the target hours from the host web. And really what you see is that these are just sort of some form of data access. There's various flavors of this, like Todd covered in his talk. So I'm getting references to lists, and I'm executing queries against them. And then I'm using sort of regular JSON code to process those. Now, when it comes to doing things like, oh, whoa, that's big enough. When it comes to doing things like fetching the data from the host web, then I have to use some special libraries like the cross-domain library. And this is this sp.request executor library that Microsoft give us. And in this case, I'm using REST, and I'm building up some strange URL and dropping several sort of tokens in it. And that helps me reach back into my host web. Just out of interest, has anybody done this kind of code, this idea of accessing data in the host web? Okay, so quite a few. So an interesting discovery I made the other day, which is, so if you can see this URL at the top, that's a fairly typical REST URL. And in this case, I'm getting a list by title, which is utilization targets, and I'm asking for its items. And you just saw in my JavaScript code that I'm using the cross-domain library to reach back into my team site. In actual fact, I don't know whether this is supported, but I found that if I access the URL on the app domain, but then use the _API method to get a REST URL, I get the same data. So I'm actually not 100% sure whether I really need the cross-domain library there, because I can get direct access to it with REST with the app domain URL. I've not seen a single MSDN sample that uses that, but it is interesting to note that it works. And if you understand how the app domain works, then you can probably guess how that works. Okay, so lots more JavaScript code. There's my public API for my app, and I'm doing some code to sort of make things red or green and so on. And those are sort of like the fundamental bits of my app. And you can see it's a reasonable amount of JavaScript, and I've not achieved much. All I've done is got a list, and I wrote some queries against it and showed it on the page. But that is the learning curve that you have with apps. Okay, now let's think about some of these other things. So down here on the right, I've kind of got this related content area, and this is kind of interesting. So this is executing a search, and basically I'm using the REST API that search provides, and I can't remember what my query is. It's something like query for the word timesheets, where file extension is docx, something like that. Now, as an app vendor, this is really useful to me because that's not my content, that's your content. And it makes my app a lot more usable because I don't know what your timesheet policy is, I don't know what your timesheet codes are, but by executing a search in your environment, I get to bring your content into my app. And that's really useful. It makes me look good because my app's more usable, and maybe it makes you look good as well because your users are happy with my app. So these aspects of apps where they can consume farm-level services or SharePoint-level services are really quite powerful. Now, as I played some more with apps, I was really starting to wonder what the boundaries were. Can I use web parts in apps? Can I use master pages? Exactly what can I do and what can't I do? Well, it gets quite interesting. So I have a page here where I've dropped on various kind of web parts onto my SharePoint page. And I'm really trying to understand exactly what web parts I can use within an app and which just aren't expected to work. So the answer is the content query web part cannot be used. It's just not expected to run within an app. An XSLT list view web part can be used, and that's me sort of retrieving some data from a certain list in my app. The content search web part can be used, which probably isn't something that I was expecting. That's subject to the usual constraints, of course. Content search web part is not in Office 365 yet, and you need an enterprise license for that thing. Page viewer web part can be used, and this is me iframing a page that's back in my team site where my app is installed. So if ever I needed to use that as a building block in my app, then I can. And a core search results web part, I can use one of those as well. So maybe to show my related content down the right-hand side, maybe I could have used that thing rather than writing a load of JavaScript code that uses the REST API. So kind of interesting, some web parts can be used, some can't.
Just a quick question on the search core results. Do you still get to influence its rendering with rendering templates when it's in this configuration?
It's unclear. It's unclear. I think you might be able to. So the question was, can I use display templates to change the output of that? I think if you put the display template in the right place and specify to this thing exactly what its display template path is, I think that might work. I haven't tried it though. Okay, so that's kind of a selection of web parts, and we see that some can be used and some can't be. Just to show you that search code, by the way. So there is my query. That was right. So it's searching for the word timesheets with a file extension of docx. And basically, I am building my REST URL to execute that search. And it's passing that query. And then we either come into the success handler or come into the failure handler, and so on. So I'll give all this code away. It's kind of using quite a few techniques, which are, I think, fundamental building blocks for apps. I'm sure there's a whole host of other scenarios that I haven't explored, but it's a big world out there. Now, the other thing to think about is master pages. So it is indeed possible for my app to use a master page. In this case, I have cob_app.master. And you'll find that that works just fine. In this case, my app takes care of things like that navigation down the left. That's coming from my master page and so on. And if I wanted a kind of a different experience, then I can use master pages for that. Now, the other thing that I wanted to look at was app parts. Now, to do this, I have to go back to my developer site, my host site. And if I go to a certain page, so I'm out of my app now, into my team site. And what we'll do is we'll add on something to this page, which is an app part that I've created with my app. So we go to Insert App Part. Very much like a web part in how I add it to the page. I'm adding this one, and this is my timesheet status. And you can see that basically that's the data coming from my app, and eventually that goes red when that async call finally gets to its callback. This is basically data from my app that's being surfaced in my team site. Now, this is useful because otherwise, if I want to if I want to understand my position, how much time I've logged, of course I have to go into my app and I have to go in through the front door and come to this area. If I don't want that and my users really want to see some of this data just in their team site, which they go into every day, then an app part could be the answer. Now, the way this ultimately works is it's just an iframe, and it's an iframe onto a special page in my app. So if I just go into it, this time I'll use the recent item entry. What I see is that I've created a page, and all it has on there is the UI for that app part. And then hopefully that makes you understand that this really is just an iframe technique. Now, what's quite cool about app parts is that you can pass properties around and sort of make them behave in certain ways. So if I edit this page, then my app part has an app part property, which is very much like a web part property. And if I come here, you'll see that it's in the configuration section down on the bottom. Now, the property that I've defined is really to say whether the target should be shown. And if I flick this to no, and OK that, then you can see that my app part is now smaller. I'm only showing how many hours I've logged and not the target. And so we have this sort of communication model where if I show you how the app part is implemented, what happens is we have some special XML. That's what defines an app part. It's called a client web part element. And I have to give it the URL of the page to iframe. But I can also pass properties to it. And in this case, I've defined an app part property, which is an enum. It can have a yes or a no. And what I need to do is actually receive that on the page which is being iframed. So if I look at my time summary page, what you'll see is that basically I'm getting that value from the URL, because that's how these app part properties are passed. And I'm using jQuery and CSS to hide that bottom part of the app part. And that's how this behavior, this sort of path of behaviors is being implemented. So there's a few things you can do. App parts are certainly useful building blocks. And if I make this code available, then maybe that's a head start onto some of these scenarios. So quite a few building blocks to get to grips with, a new set of techniques to learn. But obviously, you can find that there's quite a lot of power in apps. OK. Wrong way. So just some aspects of developing hosted apps. Of course, all that's made possible by the fact that Microsoft have vastly expanded the APIs that are on the client side of SharePoint. So if you did any JavaScript or CSOM code in SharePoint 2010, you were probably working with lists and libraries, maybe doing permissions. Now, of course, I can run searches. I can talk to user profiles. I can do document management things and understand aspects of publishing sites. And basically, that's all the changes that Microsoft have made that mean that SharePoint-hosted apps can be used for quite a few things. They are quite powerful. Now, the app web, and you might have seen this in a few places, I probably won't dwell on how the URL is structured, but really what's important to understand about how the app web works is it's actually just an IIS trick. Okay? So if you open SharePoint Manager or some other tool which will allow you to understand what's beneath your site collection, you'll find that your app is a subweb of your site collection. Now what happens with the URL is it's being presented on a completely different host. Now if you understand the web and HTTP and browsers, you'll know that that gives you some desirable things, like security for cross-site scripting. And really what this means is that your app doesn't have permission to things like the cookies that relate to your team site that your end users are receiving. And that's a good thing. That means that this app model that Microsoft is giving us is really quite secure against terms like cross-site scripting and cross-site request forgery. Now, some other things to understand about apps and how they work. You can't expect those to be like a normal site in SharePoint. You can't get to the site contents page or the site settings page. You can't go and activate features there. This is a very special area of SharePoint, and it really is the thing that's giving you the security. Because remember, if you're on Office 365, or maybe if you're allowing access to apps from the store, you want to be sure that these apps can't damage your SharePoint environment. You know, that's really what you're getting with apps, some security and assurance that they can't do damage. And there's a summary of the apps that, the web parts that I can use in the app web and the ones that you can't. Now, okay, so for this last part, I wanted to talk about a different class of app. And this is kind of, there's some debate about whether we should be building apps like this. But if you adhere to this message that sandbox solutions are deprecated and they may not be there in the future, then we might see more and more of this. So this is why I wanted to talk about it. Now, really, what we're saying is that, so we've got the app web. And if I do some default development with feature XML, or I'm creating some content types or lists, they land in the app web. I have got other options about getting my app to create things in the host web, so in the actual team site or my site where it's installed. There's special conditions that are needed for this to work, but maybe this has a place. And I've kind of been in a slightly public debate with an MVP friend of mine called Doug Ware in the United States, and he's been doing a lot of work and thought leadership around this. I don't think it's really what Microsoft intended with the app model, but perhaps there are circumstances, if you're working with clients and they want you to develop things as apps, where you might go in this direction. So let's explore it a little more. So we really get into this when we ask these questions of, you know, can an app be used to brand a SharePoint site? Or can it provision files into my team site? Or maybe even can it delete data? Well, the answer is, if it's got the right permission requests, yes, it can do anything. So although we have this segregated area where apps are isolated, we can have an app that provisions things into the host site if it has permissions to do so. And that's the permission request that the installer accepts when he or she installs the app. There is a caveat that really an app is the app permissions are an intersection of the permissions for the app and the permissions for the user running it. Okay? There is an exception to that, just to confuse you even more, which is called the app-only policy, but that doesn't apply to SharePoint-hosted apps. If you're doing any development of provider-hosted apps or other cloud apps, then I suggest go and read up on the app-only policy. It's your way of elevating permissions in an app. Session on tomorrow morning. Okay, cool. The real key message with this slide is that if you add a permission request that says, my app should have full control of the web that it's installed to, your app can do anything. Right? You have to use different development techniques, but your app can do anything. And then if you wanted to brand a SharePoint site, or you wanted to provision pages into a SharePoint site, it can now do it. Now, what's critical to understand with this is that such an app will not get into Office 365. Okay? So this is a screenshot from the page on MSDN. You probably can't read this one here, but this says, an app that asks for full control permission will not be allowed into the store. Okay? Now that's a good thing. Okay? That means that the apps that your site owners might get, they cannot do damage to your farm. So they cannot use this technique of perhaps doing things to the host site that could be undesirable. So let's take a look and we'll see whether this could be a useful approach for us to use. So I have a different app, and what we'll do is go and find that in my developer site. I might not have it here, so it'll be in my app catalog. I'm just going to add it. Okay, so you see that this app is asking for full control of this site. Okay, so my app is installing. And when we hit this, we'll see some of the examples of operations that we could do in such an app. Okay. Okay, so this app doesn't have much UI. Really, you can just see that I've got some success messages of things that I've done. So I've done some steps in my JavaScript code there. If I now go back to my developer site, what you can see is that I have this message that's happened. I've got an image that should be on the left but hasn't come in for some reason. But basically, a few things have happened to my site. So if I just navigate around, you see that I've got this red bar across the top. That's me indicating to you that I've changed the master page of my site. If I go back to the home page, you see that actually that is my home page now to this site. So somebody's placed a malicious page, whatever that might look like. Somebody's placed a malicious page into my site and also made it the default. So I'm trying to convey that, you know, an app with full control really can do things that could be undesirable in your site. However, it could also do things that may be useful. So if I go into my site settings area, just to show that, you know, I've done things like create a content type, and you could start to imagine that the app that I showed that used lists and content types and files and so on, if it had these permissions, it could have actually done it back in the host site. So we have some flexibility with the app model if we're interested in this sort of technique. And you could imagine that I could build this up and I could actually build my entire time tracking app perhaps in the host site. Now, just so that you understand exactly what's needed here, I mentioned that if we do declarative XML development, that all goes in the app web. But what I have in this app, which is my host web app, it's really all done in JavaScript. And the only programming model I have that works in this approach is basically by using JSON to do all these things. And you kind of have to pull a couple of stunts, okay? And it was kind of a lot of fun playing with this stuff and understanding what the boundaries are. But to provision that file, for example, what I have to do is I actually provision it into my app as a text file. So if I find my... Right. So what I've done is provisioned it into my app as a text file. And somewhere down here, you'll see that I've got my message, I'm partying in your host web. And what I've actually done is uploaded it to my app, and then I've hit it with a REST request to fetch the content, and then I use the JavaScript, or the JSON object, to now provision it to my host web. So as a programmer, this is very different, okay? And I have to, use some real interesting techniques to get there. But Microsoft don't prevent this stuff from happening. So if you have a client that says, I need you to develop this stuff as an app, but I really don't like this app model of having to go in through the front door, being in a separate place, I need this thing to be next to shared documents or next to the wiki library that my clients go to every day, then these techniques could be useful. And I think there is a place for them in the app world. But ultimately, you have to do some real stunts, like provisioning things to the app web as a text file and then reading it and placing it with JSON into the host site. And basically, you could imagine that if you ever needed to build such an app, you would end up building a JavaScript library of all these helper methods to use these techniques. And it's a lot of development. It's like going the long way around to meet some SharePoint requirements. But certainly, just be aware of this technique and that it can be a good option for you. Okay, some other bits on apps that you might find useful. So Microsoft fixed some very important bugs in the March 2013 update. They didn't document that they fixed them. I won't speculate why they didn't want to tell us that they fixed these things. But a couple of things I talked about on my blog, a bug around the SP host URL not being passed properly, that's been fixed. And a bug around executing search within apps, that's also been fixed. And now you can have multiple app domains with that update. That might be something that's interesting if you want to have multiple zones around apps. You should develop apps on SSL. So SSL really is a requirement for apps. And I think my message here is, because you need that in production, also make sure that you've got it in place in dev as well. And that's, I think, the right way to develop apps. Now, configuring SSL in dev is kind of complex. I'm not going to walk through all the steps, but the way I do is to use self-SSL, and there's a couple of gotchas in there because there's a bug in self-SSL. But if you sort of imagine that as a process and use that as a reference slide, then that will work out fine for you. Now, continuous integration for apps is kind of an interesting area. So I did a lot of work around continuous integration for farm and sandbox solutions. I've spoke about it at conferences and so on. Now, Microsoft have done a lot of work around CI for apps, and they've got some PowerShell scripts that are really quite powerful. So you can do automated builds with TFS around apps. And we kind of had some coordination. So I have a project at SharePoint-CI.codeplex.com. And what Microsoft have done, have created a sister project at Office SharePoint-CI.codeplex.com. And both sites sort of link to each other. Now, their stuff is really good. I've looked at it. It works with on-premises and Office 365. And really what they're doing is using PowerShell and .NET CSOM, which can be used against either on-premises or Office 365, to install your app. So you can start to use these CI techniques to get efficient development processes. And it can also be used with Visual Studio Online as well. So a couple of reference slides, really. You hit a lot of problems when you're developing apps. You know, if you're starting to get on board with this message of everything should be developed as an app, then there's quite a lot of problems that you run into. So some key ones are, you know, you either tried to F5 deploy and you got an error message to say that side loading of apps isn't enabled. That's probably because you're not deploying to a developer site, or you haven't activated the site loading feature. So basically, you can F5 deploy to a My site or a team site, but you have to activate a special feature to do that. Some other potential issues, app parts are quite a lot of fun. You really need to make sure your page has the right JavaScript references. I was about to write a blog post on that, and then an MVP friend, Stefan Eskean, he built me to it. So that's his reference on exactly what JavaScript files you need. And you'll need to know this stuff if you're going to look at these scenarios. Some other interesting things to think about. When you start to understand, okay, I understand these building block techniques. What am I really going to do for my clients? You come into considerations like, let's say that I end up with 100 instances of my app in use, not necessarily for 100 different clients. Maybe it's one client, but it's installed in 100 different team sites. What happens then when you need to update a JavaScript file or a CSS file? It's in 100 different places, and you can't force a user to upgrade. You know, it's just like the app model on your phone, where upgrades are completely optional, and you either take them or you just leave them sitting there. So how do you update JavaScript and CSS and things like that? Well, I think the answer that we're coming to is that really, maybe those files should be somewhere else outside of the app, and you're not going to use the defaults in Visual Studio. Maybe put them in Azure, centralize them. You'll need to take care of versioning probably, but that seems to be a better model. I've got a blog post in draft to say that Azure is the new SharePoint layouts directory. And I think that's the way that we see it, right? It's just a far better place than having these files within your app. In terms of architecture, we've got this consideration of that whole section that I showed you around apps that provision to the host web. You know, should I do that? Is that a good idea? And I think the answer is, well, maybe it can be. You know, if the app is trusted, if you know where that app has come from, and you're comfortable with the permission requests that come with it, then maybe that's okay to do that. You have to consider whether the app framework is giving you something over a farm or sandbox solution, okay? Because those two approaches will be way easier to develop with, and you'll meet your client's requirements way quicker. But what if the client is saying this stuff has to be apps? You know, maybe they're on Office 365, so farm solutions are out, and maybe we're heeding this message that the sandbox is, you know, all we're saying is it's listed as deprecated. That's as far as Microsoft have really told us. So if we're not comfortable developing a sandbox solution because we think it's going away, then really, you know, we're looking at apps, and maybe you do have to use those techniques if you need your stuff to provision into the host web. Finally, I think we've looked at SharePoint-hosted apps, and we've seen that you can achieve quite a lot with them. You know, as long as you can get on board with JavaScript and you can understand which things in the box you can use, then you can achieve quite a lot. But sometimes you're going to need more. So what are the factors that tip you over the edge and say, okay, I now need a provider-hosted app or a cloud app? So I think maybe you just need to go beyond JavaScript. You know, maybe you want a complex service layer, or maybe you need back-end data in SQL. Going from JavaScript direct to SQL, that's not easy. That's not really possible. So you probably need to go beyond a SharePoint-hosted app then. Maybe you need remote event receivers, something we didn't really talk about in depth here, but that's how I have code that responds to the app installed or app upgraded event. That's server-side WCF code that needs to go somewhere. It needs to be provider-hosted or Azure auto-hosted, and it cannot be JavaScript. Maybe my app needs a scheduled process. Again, JavaScript isn't the right case for that. Maybe my clients are using SAML claims for their team sites or their My sites, whatever. Apps at the moment cannot install on sites that run SAML. So if I'm using ADFS for authentication or something like that, then actually that's not going to work. And maybe I just don't want to do the whole thing in JavaScript. Maybe I'm not really comfortable with JavaScript, or maybe we've got teams of people that can do plain .NET development. Maybe they're familiar with MVC, or maybe they're good at LAMP and so on. So I think those are the factors that probably drive you to go from a SharePoint-hosted app into the cloud app model. Okay, and that's it for me. Thank you very much, and if you've got questions.